What is painting? Seems like a simple enough question, but I think there's a variety of ways to define it. Let's take a look at painting from a few different angles and create some ideas about it that we can use as painters. My definition of painting, or the one that I use for my own work, has to do with this idea of being in the zone. And that being in the zone is for me as a painter, as well as for someone looking at my work, the viewer. Let's look at skiing, swimming, meditating. These are all activities where we naturally think of getting in the zone. So what does that mean, getting in the zone? Well, for me, it means going deeper into the present moment. That could be using our right brain, but basically the main idea for me is that being in that present moment, being aware of what's going on right then. I feel that painting is very similar to that. The difference between skiing, swimming, and meditating and painting is that with painting we end up with a product that we can then share so that someone else looking at our work can have that same zone experience. I feel that the more that we can be in the zone while we're painting, the more that that painting will allow that experience to transfer to the viewer. Now, this being in the zone may not be a valid goal for every painter or for every painting. But this is at the core of why I paint, and this is what painting means to me. So between this lecture and the next one, I'd like you to think about why you paint and what is the meaning of painting to you, and possibly get your own definition of painting, especially after this lecture when we go through a lot of different ideas about it. First, I'd like to say I believe that painting is important. As I said in the introduction, it's not a frivolous activity. It has a lot of meaning for us as painters as well as for our culture, our world. So I have 4 things listed here of why I think painting is important. Images have power, they give a quality of life, and images contribute to our world. And if you don't make your paintings, no one else will. Let me expand on some of these a little bit more. First of all, I'd like to say that it's been scientifically proven that images are powerful influences for humans. It's also in the act of painting that allows us, while painting, to be more present, like I talked about in this idea of being in the zone. A painting offers the same experience to someone viewing that end result. We as painters take a journey while we're painting, and the painting I like to think of as a receipt of this journey. We humans are creative beings, and we require regular practice of our creativity for well-being and for quality of life. Each person is unique like a snowflake. All our experiences, preferences, DNA, life choices, they make us one of a kind. And that's why I say, if you don't make your work, no one else will. So these are all ways that I think of painting as being an important pursuit. I was thinking about bringing our main goals as a painter and for our work to 3 simple basic concepts or goals. They would be 1, initial attraction. When we do a painting, we want someone to be attracted to it. If our painting's hanging on a wall, we don't want them to just walk right by and not pay attention to it. We want them to stop and look at it, have an experience. And we could say, well, a red stop sign on the road while we're driving, that has initial attraction. It makes us stop. But we want more than just a red stop sign for a painting. We want to go to our second goal, which would be to hold the viewer's attention. So once that viewer goes by the wall of paintings and stops at our painting, that's our first goal, we want our second goal to come into place, which is we want them to be attracted to it long enough for the painting to have enough viewing power so that our viewer will gaze at this painting long enough to recognize what we're trying to say, create their own idea about it, and connect to us. That's our third goal. Connect to us through this painting. What is it like to be a human being who's painting? We want to connect to our viewer. So these are what I post as our 3 main goals that we're going to be revisiting many, many times during the course of this class, and to look at how we can improve our paintings so that we get these 3 main goals. initial attraction, holding someone's attention. We could also say giving them an experience and connecting to them as a human being to another human being through the work. So let's continue looking at ideas about painting. The most significant concept about painting for me, other than working with that concept of being in the zone that I mentioned, is the idea that painting is an image on a flat surface. Yet if that image doesn't contain the illusion of space, and here's the key for me, if it doesn't have that experience or the illusion of space, it won't get us our first goal. Remember that was attraction. And it certainly isn't going to get us the next two. If we don't get the initial attraction, we're not going to have that viewer have an experience, and we're certainly not going to connect. So the first goal is the most important. And let's look at how we can get a viewer to be attracted to our work in the first place. So let's look at the difference between wallpaper and a painting. Now, you've got to agree they both have the same definition of being an image on a flat surface. But what's the difference between these? We can see that the wallpaper on the left, and I have a still life in front of that wallpaper just to show you that it's wallpaper, but I'm not talking about the photograph and the vase and the table in front of it, just the wallpaper behind it. If we compare these two images on a flat surface, there's got to be a difference, because the one on the left, it doesn't have what I call presence. That to me is the difference. I also call it visual tension in my book, but lately I like using this term presence. Now if we look at the wallpaper, it has a modest or low presence. It doesn't ask to be noticed. And a good wallpaper designer knows that wallpaper is not supposed to be loud and yelling at us and getting attention. It would drive us crazy going into a room where we want to talk to people and interact and sit on the furniture. We want our eyes to be able to roam around the room and not be glued to the wall, to the wallpaper. So wallpaper is meant to have what I call a modest or low presence. The painting on the right, however, by Turner, it has what I call a strong presence, a strong attracting presence. So unlike the wallpaper, it would be really hard, I believe, to walk by the Turner hanging on a wall without paying attention to it. So I believe that this idea of presence or visual tension, it jolts the brain so that the viewer feels like there's something unusual about this image on a flat surface. It feels like it has some space. So the Turner painting has a stronger presence created by the impression of space, the illusion that it has some space. If there's no sense of space in a painting, our eyes don't even bother to look, to go there, because there's no way for them to move around, no reason to look. If you think about it, a painting is like a window, and it engages our eyes to look out and see what's out there. If there's no sense of space, it's the flat wall, and we're not even going to bother looking at it. So again, this idea of space that we offer in a painting doesn't have to be deep space, feeling like the far distance between the window and how far the horizon line is in the background. It doesn't have to be this deep like the Turner, but it has to have some kind of experience of space that feels like we're looking out of a window. Somehow it needs to be in there. And we'll be going through a lot of different ways about that in this class. If we picture a wall painted in one solid color, it's rarely going to have presence. It's just going to be there in the background. It's not going to be grabbing our attention. Wallpaper has a small amount of this visual tension, but not enough to catch our attention. And without any sense of space, wallpaper definitely won't engage the eye long enough to give the viewer some type of memorable or noticeable experience. So let's summarize so far. If you agree with my logic at this point, we can create this definition of painting. A painting is an image on a flat surface that has enough presence to get attention. It is meant to attract and engage. This is a main premise of my class, how to enhance key elements in a painting to attract and engage. Let's identify key elements for a painting. Form and space. We have a built-in mechanism in our eyes and brain to separate things into these two categories, form and space, whenever we view anything, reality, things in real life, or painted images. This is what we do. Instead of form and space, those terms, we could use other terms like solid and air, shapes and background. Again, form and space, lots of ways to look at it, whatever makes you feel like you could relate to these two main concepts. The main idea I want to get across with these next few slides is that I believe we have an automatic program in our heads that goes into play as soon as we use our eyes, which is most of the time. It might have developed in humans early on from our past to increase our ability to hunt. To catch deer, we need to be able to separate it from the forest. Let's look at some examples of paintings to see how this plays out to create a sense of space in an image. Looking at this painting, note how your eyes naturally respond by separating form from space, in this case figure from background. It's relatively easy with this painting, don't you think, to separate the form from space or the figure from the background. Now, I'm not talking about the edge, that very edge where it feels like we could cut the figure out of the space. Instead, I'm talking about how our eyes you could actually feel the muscle pulling something forward and the background back. So again, don't look at the edge, but it's about these two things separating form from space. It's almost as if our eyes want to separate them rather than flattening it all. We want to see the difference between the figure and the background. Just as I said, maybe as hunters, we wanted to separate the deer from the forest so we could hunt. Now, how did Rembrandt make this easy for us to see the figure from the space so quickly here? So what are some of our tools as painters? Now, while we start looking at paintings in these slides, and I start to ask you questions, what I'd like you to do is take a moment and really look at the painting and breathe in and out deeply, breathe slowly, and allow your eyes to do the work. Because a big part of this class is that I believe that our eyes are intelligent, they have wisdom. And it's our eyes' wisdom that we need to use most as painters. So take a deep breath, breathe in and out, look at this painting, and notice how your eyes will separate the form from the background. Let's look at another example. So here is a Picasso, and this has kind of a flatter feeling of space than the last painting, but it still has an experience of space. And that's when I mentioned that a painting doesn't have to have a super deep illusion of space, like you're looking out of a window at a far, far distance. In this case, with the Picasso, it's a little more narrow, as if we were looking out the window and seeing a tree pretty close to that window. It's still a flatter space, but it's not as flat as wallpaper. It still has the experience of space. And to test this, let's do our eye trick here by looking at the painting and seeing how our eyes naturally want to separate the form from the space. So again, what is it that we have as tools, as painters, to create this experience of space and allow the viewer the ease to separate form from space? Well, anything with defined edges is often seen as form, while the rest that doesn't have defined edges is seen as space. Again, this is not always true, but in general it is. If we think of an island in an ocean, we could see the outline of the island where it distinguishes itself between that form and the rest of the ocean. So the separation of form and space is important, as our eyes are hardwired to do this immediately upon viewing. I already mentioned there's other ways to say form and space. I just want to remind you: solid and air, shapes and background. But I'll be using form and space mostly in the class. So use whatever terms allow you to feel like you understand this concept the best. Other contemporary terms for form and space, we could say positive and negative space. Some of you who have taken art classes, the teacher will often use the terms positive and negative space. That's not good and bad. Positive space is the form and negative space would be the background. We could also say shapes in a field, or one that I like is called forms in an energized space. I love that idea, forms in an energized space. Lots of ways to say it. Now, let's go back to that wallpaper slide for a second. Let's say on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the easiest and 10 being the hardest, for our muscles to separate form from space. If we look at wallpaper, would that be very easy, an easy visual tension to separate the form from the space? That would be a 1, let's say. Whereas the painting by Turner, to separate form from space, or the Picasso that we just saw, is going to it's going to take a little bit more eye muscle. It's going to be a little more engaging and therefore a little more interesting. So now let's look at a few other paintings in a row. Starting with an easy way to separate form from space to images that make it harder to separate form from space. And what I'd like to do is to show you that the harder it is to separate form from space, the more difficult it is for our eye to engage in what it wants to automatically, and that it could create a more engaging painting. Now, each person has their own, what I call window of visual tension. So you might think, oh, Nancy's saying, let's make everything a 10. Let's make everything really difficult to separate form from space. But for most of our viewing audience, 8, 9, and 10 is going to be something that's so confusing for their eye that they won't even want to look at it. So the scale from 1 to 10 isn't necessarily bad to good. Instead, it's how much effort are we asking our viewer to expend in using this autopilot that we have to separate form from space while they're looking at the painting. What we want to do is we want to pick what works for us. Maybe we like, I tend to like lower on the scale, a lower visual tension, because for me, my paintings are more meditative. That's the goal that I have. I want to draw someone in and have them have a relaxed experience. If I have a number 10 on that visual tension scale, it's going to create a little bit of a difficulty with their eyes and probably keep them from that meditative state. So do you see how I'm saying that from, say, 1 to 10 is our choice? It's not a good-bad scale. So let's look at some more images so that we can really get a feel for this feeling of separating form from space, and how there's certain things we can use in our painting to make it easier on lower on the scale and more difficult. In this painting, let's take a moment and really stare at it. Remember, breathing deep, breathing in, breathing out. And notice, become aware of your hardwired capacity for separating form from space. Let's just stare at it for a few seconds. Now, each of us is going to look at this painting and see something different. Each way we see it is based on our own vision preferences. For example, some of us are going to head right for bright colors. Some of us are going to see lines first. Others are going to go for the movement. Everyone's eyes head for something different, usually what we like, and we tend to disregard everything else. To create the best paintings we can, it's important to start to activate other aspects of our vision. All you need to do is ask a question, and your eyes will be directed towards that. So ask the question while you're looking. So if you ask while you're looking at this painting, what wants to come forward and what wants to go back? Ask yourself that question, really focus on the painting, breathing in and out, and you're going to watch your eyes actually emphasize even more, pull things forward and what goes back. Now, what looks like figures or shapes as opposed to what looks like space? So let's all focus on the form and space relationships in this painting. And sometimes we think we see an image all at once, but we don't. Let's slow down the viewing process. That's what we're going to be doing in this class, slowing down the viewing process so we can pay attention to lots of things that your average viewer wouldn't even notice. Again, make sure you breathe deeply in and out while viewing. And the breathing helps to slow down this viewing process so we can really soak in the image in a deeper way. Now, looking and breathing, it may seem overly simple, but it's very important to start to master the art of seeing. Is trying to separate form from space here with this painting easier or more difficult than the previous image? Pay attention to how your eye muscles feel in viewing form from space here. Does it feel more demanding? This is what I call visual tension. How our eye muscles work with more perceived effort or less effort. This muscle tension we create when our hardwiring makes us attempt to define form from space. To feel as though we are pulling the forms forward from what we perceive as a background space. Let me take a moment and define visual tension. I said that it's also, I like to use the term presence, but visual tension is actually, I consider it a measure of high or low or somewhere in between of the resistance the eye has in viewing something it expects versus viewing something it doesn't expect. In this case, form from space. Here's a Mondrian painting, and take a moment and think about the difference between this Mondrian and the wallpaper we looked at before. They both have a similar type of narrow space or flattened space. Yet I do believe that this Mondrian has presence, much more presence than the wallpaper that we looked at in the beginning. Again, let's look at this painting in terms of our eye's natural tendency to separate form from space. Once you start to separate form from space, or allow some things to come forward towards you and allow some things to feel like they're farther back, think about how this viewing experience feels for you. So the white in the background fills or takes up more area, so is often seen as space, while the smaller shapes that are the yellow, red, and blue, they're defined with an edge. Remember, I talked about that island in the ocean. Let's play with this idea. If you think the white is space and the colors are form, stare at the image, breathe slowly, and ask your eyes to see the white as shapes and to reverse it. Now, for some of you, you might automatically see the white as the form and the colors as the background. Again, we all look at things differently, but we do have the same autopilot, and that's what this class is about, is looking at where we as humans have similar tendencies for viewing. So did you try that? Did you try to see one thing as form and the other as space? Let's say the colors as form and the white as space. And then while you're breathing, try to reverse it. Try to stare at the white as space and the colors as background. If you really look hard enough, you can actually reverse it using your eyes, your eye muscles in a whole different way. The more difficult the effort, the higher the visual tension. Visual tension that is too low is like wallpaper and won't have much presence. It won't get attention. And as I said before, I just want to repeat this to make sure I'm clear, is that on the other hand, visual tension that is too high will push someone away from viewing. Like some work you might find in contemporary venues that prefer images using shock value or overdosing on multimedia. If it's too low or too high, it won't engage a viewer. We all need to find that right sweet spot, that window of visual tension for our own work. And then this ultimately determines our optimal audience. Another analogy I like to think about for visual tension is getting a massage in a health spa. Often the massage therapist will start our session by asking us, do we like a gentle, relaxing touch, or do we want them to go in deep tissue pressure and really get those knots out? It's not a good or bad thing. It's a matter of preference. Some of us like the gentle touch and some of us like the hard pressure. And it's the same with visual tension when we're looking at a painting. Some of us are going to want it to be easy to look at and relaxing. And some of us want that aggressive, more difficult viewing experience. Here's another Mondrian that I wanted to use just for us to practice looking at this one concept of how we separate form from space. Now here Mondrian may be blurring the lines figuratively between form and space just to create enough visual tension to force the eyes to imagine a flat feeling space. By reducing space to almost flat, the emphasis then is on color next to color instead of form from space. What I believe Mondrian is doing here is playing a trick with us and saying, hey, instead of just automatically trying to move form and space back and forward, instead your eyes are going to have so much trouble doing that they're going to start looking at something else, which would be color next to color. Now this is what Joseph Albers, he is the celebrated color expert from the last century. This is what Joseph Albers did for his work. He only used squares and reduced the space to a minimal depth so that the viewer's eye would be more encouraged to relate one color next to another. Notice how your eyes view this painting with the desire to separate space from form. The level of visual tension depends on how much effort it takes our eyes to accommodate what our mind wants us to see. In this case, our hardwiring need to separate form from space, while viewing an image that is very flat in feeling, creates the visual tension and adds to its presence. Here the artist Escher plays tricks with our eyes by working with this hardwiring we have for viewing and separating space and form. By slowing down the viewing of it, breathing deeply and slowly, you can start to be aware of this natural tendency to make something come forward and push something back. I know I'm repeating myself a lot here, but what I want to do is get us in the practice of just slowing that viewing experience down to a very slow level and looking at different images with just this one concept. What's the visual tension for this painting, do you think, would be for an average viewer? Well, I find it interesting that most of Escher's work is in black and white. Do you think adding color to this painting would change the visual tension in this piece? Would adding color help the viewing experience or inhibit it? Just asking you a question. For me, I think he was wise in keeping it black and white because there is so much visual tension between form and space here that adding color, I think, would put it over the top and make it more too difficult for your average viewer to look at. This painting sure gives our eye muscles a workout, right? And the visual tension would be high. Again, visual tension is the measure of how you feel. Again, everybody feels differently. Everyone has a different window of visual tension. But visual tension is the measure of how you feel when you pay attention to the effort your eye muscles exert in trying to make sense out of the image. In this case, we're just looking at one program, this separation of form from space, one auto program that our brain has, and we have many, and all of these come into play when we're creating a painting and trying to get those three goals: getting attention, giving the viewer an experience, and connecting with the viewer. And while we're talking about this idea of space and form and how important it is in the viewing of paintings and images, let's look at how this plays out with two different mediums, drawing and painting. So here we have a Michelangelo and an O'Keeffe. If we look at the Michelangelo, we can see that form is separated from space by using line. So we could say that a drawing uses line to distinguish between form and space. The line actually feels like it carves out the space like a sculptor. Whereas if we look at the O'Keeffe, the painting, this painting uses color next to color to give the illusion of form from space. Let's go back and see that last slide of the Picasso to show how he uses both line and color to aid in separating form from space. As we move through the different lecture videos in this class, they get kind of heady, and we are getting a little analytical and intellectual with paintings. And the idea is that I want us to feel that our eyes get stronger and can make better decisions, and we can become better painters because of that. So I want to take a moment about something important, which is that our painting process, I like to separate it into two completely separate phases, the play phase and the critique phase. Or we could say the play phase and the editing phase. I love using the word editing. Critique sounds too harsh sometimes. So what I want to say is that when we're painting, when in the act of painting, we don't want to engage our head with intellectual ideas, critiques, editing. We want to keep them separate. There's an interview that I did with a professor in Florida, and it's a short video clip. I just wanted to show it here, where I talk about the difference for me in my painting process between the play phase and the editing phase. I think that the most important thing about painting is that you're expressing something from your inner unseen self, and it's coming out into a tangible, visible form. And that's, if you think about going to a therapist, that's what happens in therapy. And sometimes we can
therapists
be really...
are expensive, art's easier.
Yeah. And so it's like self-therapy all day, which sometimes can feel really upsetting, and sometimes it can feel really joyful. And I think that allow yourself to have this come out without being without impeding it. Just allow it to come out, and then be nice to it when it comes out. You know, don't kill it. Don't get angry. Don't judge. Don't, you know, but all that negative stuff that we're taught, you know, this is a beautiful thing that you have. Now, so keep making things. Just make it and allow it, and then put it aside, and make something else and allow it and put it aside. Allow yourself to keep moving through things, through layers of yourself. And then if you want, you know, just because you made it and you're feeling joyful about it does not mean it has enough presence to, I have this threefold thing for myself, three things. It has to have enough because I make stuff a lot of times that are just, I throw it in a drawer. It's like that, you know, it was fun to make, but it's not going to make it to be able to be framed and stuck in a gallery and, you know, and sold. So the three things, when you're ready to sell or you want to show it to people or give it as gifts, it should have three aspects to its presence. It should get attention on a wall, that's a big thing, get attention. And then have enough in there, enough eye choreography to engage the viewer for long enough to have an experience, right? If he gets attention, like a stop sign gets attention, but that doesn't have an experience. It has to have enough in there to have experience. And the third, I just added this, it's not in my Create Perfect Paintings book, just talks about the two, but the third is it should connect to the artist there should be a direct connection to that artist through the work, either emotionally, intellectually, or spiritually, or all three. And there you go.
Nice. That's some really good advice. I mean, and that's the thing, you know, you want your painting to have an emotional connection, not just to your audience, but they need to feel that emotional connection.
I have a blog article that I recently wrote that artwork can have an intellectual, it depends on your intent. When you get to a certain point where you say, I want the viewer to respond this way, then you edit your work. You allow the inner to come out, and then you say, well, here it is. It's like a book. You write in a diary, but you don't expect to put a cover on it and sell it. You have to edit it. And that's the part 2 that I talk about if you want to sell your work, which if you're just starting to paint, don't even think about it. You know, just because it'll ruin the joyful experience of just letting the inner out. But then when you have the out, and don't throw it away, because then you can later, when you're ready for that second part of editing, then you could go back and look at some of those and you might say, hey, I hated this, but now I like it. You know, you have different eyes. So in summary, we can say that when we're editing our paintings for stronger presence, there's 3 main goals. We have attraction or attention, we have the experience, and we have connection. So with those in mind, I'd like to suggest that you check out the assignment document that I have with this course for this one particular lecture, with some ideas, mostly writing, some book suggestions, and some other things that I feel would be helpful to process the material we have in this particular lecture. I think it would be good to take some time, even if you're just jotting some things down on a scrap piece of paper. I recommend maybe keeping a journal or using your computing device, whatever makes you happy. But just take some time between this lecture and the next one just to do something, some kind of a ritual or exercise. Again, I have some great suggestions in the attached document with this class. Okay, take some time and see you in the next video.